Welcome back to No Nonsense Catholic. We're talking about the customs and traditions of Passiontide, particularly the veiling of crosses and images. And I consulted a number of sources doing the research for this segment, and it was interesting that virtually all the Novus Ordo, the post-Vatican II sources that I consulted, tell us that, and they all agree that the practice of veiling images alerts us that, quote, something is different. That while it can be startling at first, the last 2 weeks of Lent are a time of immediate preparation for the celebration of the Easter Triduum. That's Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Sunday as well. Let's see. So the veils serve as a reminder to prepare ourselves. Now, the explanation that's provided by St. John's Seminary in Boston is typical, so I'm just going to read it to you. The veiled images build within us a longing for Easter Sunday. The veils seem out of place, even counterintuitive. It can seem strange that the crucifix is covered up during Passiontide. Through this absence of images, our senses are heightened, and we become more aware of what is missing. Similarly, the suppression of the Alleluia during Lent effectively demonstrates that we are in exile from our true home, where the angels sing Alleluia without ceasing. When images are unveiled before the Easter Vigil, we are reminded that we, in a sense, live in a veiled world. It is through our own death that we are able to see our true home, and the veil is lifted. Christ lifts the veil through his resurrection. Now, I found it interesting that all of these Novus Ordo sources used the exact same words. Something's different, seems out of place, counterintuitive. And it makes me wonder if they didn't all consult some common source. Maybe there's a statement from the U.S. bishops or something regarding Passiontide. But in any case, all of this is true, but the historical origin of the practice lies elsewhere. It likely derives from a custom noted in Germany since the 9th century of extending a large cloth in front of the altar from the very beginning of Lent. The cloth was called the Hungertuch, which is German for hunger cloth, and it hid the altar entirely from the faithful during Lent, and it wasn't removed until Holy Wednesday at the words, and the veil of the temple was rent in two, during the reading of the Passion on Holy Wednesday. Now, I suspect that this is because the medieval origin of veiling images in Lent. Because of that medieval origin, that's what caused some modern authors, and I'm sorry, I refuse to call them scholars, modern authors, conjecture that the real reason for this practice is that the poor, ignorant, and often illiterate faithful needed some way to know that it was Lent. I cannot tell you how intensely I detest this kind of condescending ahistorical claptrap. Trust me, medieval Catholics didn't need any special reminders to know when Lent began. Right? Not only did their entire lives revolve around the liturgical calendar in a way that no modern Catholics does, even in religious institutions, but they would have already been preparing, like Catholics all the way up until 1970, they would have been preparing for Lent since Septuagesima Sunday and through the short season of Septuagesimotide, which many, if not most modern Catholics have probably never even heard of. But I digress again. The use of the hunger cloth was most likely an early medieval remnant of the even more ancient practice of public penance, in which penitents were ritually expelled from the church at the beginning of Lent and had to stand outside the church in sackcloth and ashes until the Easter Vigil. And now the idea is that after the ritual of public penance fell into disuse, thanks be to God, the entire congregation symbolically, which is to say liturgically, entered into the order of penitence by the imposition of ashes on Ash Wednesday. So nobody was singled out for public penance. Everybody joins in this liturgical season of penance. And then the entire congregation was, symbolically expelled from the church by concealing the altar from view until they were reconciled to God at Easter. And so for comparable motives, later on in the Middle Ages, the images of crosses, crucifixes, and saints were covered from the start of Lent. Now, the rule of limiting the veiling to Passiontide, the last 2 weeks of Lent, only first officially appears with a publication of the bishop's ceremonial in the 17th century. So after Vatican II, The modernists wanted to abolish all veiling of images, but as we can see, thankfully, the practice survived, although it is not obligatory unless mandated by the local bishops' conference. And there you have it. But as a final note, even where traditional veiling is observed, liturgical nonsense still rears its ugly head. And I've experienced this myself in the past, and maybe you have as well, perhaps even in your own parish. And that is, as you enter a church during Lent, you go to bless yourself, only to discover that the holy water is empty. The holy water font has no holy water in it. Or I had the experience of going to a church where it had been replaced with sand. Okay. Now, this practice is not only, imbecilic, it's a genuine abuse. The question of whether it's legitimate to remove holy water during Lent was answered by the Congregation of the Doctrine of Worship and the Sacraments back in 2004. They said, and I quote, "This dicastery responds that the removing of holy water from the fonts during the season of Lent is not permitted, in particular for two reasons. One, the liturgical legislation in force does not foresee this innovation, which, in addition to being praeter legem, which is Latin for outside the law, is contrary to a balanced understanding of the season of Lent, which, though truly being a season of penance, is also a season rich in symbolism of water and baptism constantly evoked in the liturgical texts. Number two, the encouragement of the Church that the faithful avail themselves frequently of the sacraments is to be understood to apply also to the season of Lent. The fast and abstinence which the faithful embrace in this season does not extend to abstaining from the sacraments or the sacramentals of the Church. You would assume that you would have more frequent recourse to them. I remember the first time I ever encountered this, I was talking to a friend of mine, and I asked him, about what they were doing. There was church says, well, our church, we're fasting from holy water, which is, when you put it that way, you see how ridiculous it is. And I should mention that this is an abuse, and the abuse of the empty holy water fonts, though, likely comes from a misunderstanding of an actually legitimate practice. The response from the Congregation of Divine Worship says, quote, "The practice of the Church has been to empty the holy water fonts on the days of the sacred Triduum in preparation of the blessing of the water at Easter Vigil, which is part of the baptismal rite for the catechumens that are coming into the church. And it corresponds to those days on which the Eucharist is not celebrated. That is Good Friday and Holy Saturday. So there's a liturgical practice of no holy water in the font, but only on the only 2 days of the year when there is no Mass, and in preparation for the sacraments of initiation. And by the way, although the Easter Vigil takes place on Saturday evening, liturgically, sundown is the beginning of Easter Sunday. So there it is. Okay, I saw an article the other day on the 1 Peter 5 website. It's a traditionalist website, but it was from a fellow named Stephen O'Reilly, and it was called Whither Bene-papism. And Bene-papism, aka Bene-vacantism, is a reference to the belief of a small, I want to say tiny fringe of Catholics who have convinced themselves that Benedict XVI didn't really resign or did so invalidly and was therefore still Pope, whether he knew it or not, thus rendering Jorge Bergoglio an anti-pope by default. So it's like sedevacantism, only specific to Benedict XVI, hence Bene-vacantism. Now, I have a couple of acquaintances who fell into this opinion, and I recall making the point that, Pope or not, Joseph Ratzinger was not long for this world, and that at his inevitable demise, they would have to either recognize Pope Francis's legitimacy or simply become garden variety sedevacantists, most of whom don't think we've had a legitimate pope since Pius XII. And unfortunately, in some cases, that's precisely what's happened. But what really struck me is that it's still a thing at all. Apparently there have been 4 books written about the Bene-vacantist theory. And it's unimaginable to me that there's enough material for one book. But, it never ceases to amaze me how human beings are so good at inventing conspiracy theories and finding ways to get around the obvious. But the fellow who wrote this article Mr. Stephen O'Reilly has also written his own book to refute the many Byzantine arguments that have been concocted to support this frankly unreasonable theory. And for my part, I don't think it requires a book-long response. The foundational argument for Bene-vacantism is that Ratzinger's resignation was invalid due to some technical defect of form. In other words, he didn't resign correctly, so he's still Pope, I should say. Or even less realistically, that he never really intended to resign completely in the first place, and mistakenly thought that he could somehow share the papacy with Francis. Or even less realistically, that his resignation was purposely invalid so that he could secretly remain Pope in order to expose the corruption that he was too weak to confront openly. It's like, yeah, I know. So I'll try and explain in due course. Now, for what it's worth, and for what I hope is the last time, here is my response to the various theories of Bene-vacantism. First things first, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger was legitimately elected to the papacy in 2005 after the death of his predecessor, Pope St. John Paul II. As Benedict XVI, Ratzinger's relation to canon law became that of supreme legislator. Canon 332 says the Roman pontiff obtains full and supreme power in the Church by his acceptance of legitimate election together with episcopal consecration. Full and supreme power. What does that mean? Just what it says. Now, while a pope is certainly bound by the deposit of faith, he's sworn, in which we were talking about this on the Terry and Jesse show today, he's sworn to defend and to pass on the deposit unchanged, but he's not entirely subject to canon law, which as supreme legislator, he can modify or technically even abolish at his good pleasure. Nor does canon law admit of any appeal or recourse against a sentence or decree of the Pope. Canon 333, there is neither appeal nor recourse against a judgment or a decree of the Roman pontiff. And in the slam dunk is Canon 1404, the first see is judged by no one. Therefore, when Benedict, as supreme legislator, made manifest his will to resign the papacy, no alleged canonical defective form could impede that resignation, since no one is competent to judge the Pope. Again, Canon 332 states, if it happens that the Roman pontiff resigns his office, okay, this is foreseen in canon law. If it happens that the Roman pontiff resigns his office, it is required for validity that his resignation is made freely and properly manifested, but not that it is accepted by anyone. In other words, Benedict XVI resigned whether you like it or not, no matter who you are.